Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'm really glad to come after a coffee break because that was really nice and a good chance to just say hello as well. Um, Wes and I today are doing some almost joint presentations. I know that there are two presentations on the panel, but they are really connected because what we're talking about is the Innovative Learning Environments and Student Experience project. I'm going to do the first bit of this and then Wes will do the second. But before we get into that, I thought it was probably worth acknowledging, oh, Tina, there you go. Worth acknowledging that Wes and I come from a group called the Learning Environments Applied Research Network. And it's a network that started at the University of Melbourne and it now extends both Melbourne and Perth, the opposite sides of Australia, with my university at Edith Cowan University. And we're really pleased to be part of it. So Learn has a long history of getting Category 1 grants, so we call them in Australia, but our highest national competitive grants. And we've used these grants over a decade and a half to track innovative learning environments. And that has come across a whole range of topics. So everything from starting with design and sustainable design into how we think about evaluation, which is an area that Wes and I are both quite passionate about, thinking about teachers and how they transition into these spaces, thinking about how schools can be used as community hubs to bring the whole community into school spaces. The latest project is starting to think about inclusion, and I was really pleased in reading through the program for today that there are so many key words that we have at Learn that are also coming up here. So it's a fantastic time to be talking together. The next thing that we see at Learn is actually the need for a big project around students and all students in this space. And this is where the Innovative Learning Environments and Student Experience study comes in. So we're going to give you a little bit of an overview today. It is a 3-phase project. We're in the second phase at the moment, the development phase. I will talk mostly today about the scoping study phase, which is the phase that we've completed. And then Wes will come in and talk about where we currently are at with the development phase. The aim for us is actually that we're moving into a full project. So looking at getting the tools and then how broad can we make this across the globe? And that's something that will be coming, hopefully, in the next 6 to 8 months. So the scoping study that I'm talking about today, it used 2 different approaches to collect data from a whole range of people across the world. The first approach we used was regional workshop teams, and we had 217 different people across academia, across industry, so everything from architects, acousticians, furniture manufacturers, and a range of allied industries, and also education experts, so both policymakers and practitioners. They came from 19 different countries in the scoping study, and across those 19 countries, we had 21 different teams of people working together. The second approach was a Delphi study, and we ran this in parallel to the regional workshop teams. We had 27 individuals, again, across those 3 multidisciplinary groups that organised themselves into panels, and they came from 10 different countries. But before we get into the scoping study, I think it's really important to address the question of where are the students, because I've been talking about lots of professionals. And it was a question that we got a bit at the start of the project, and it was one that we asked ourselves in the design of the project, that if we're doing a project on student experience, then how do we involve students in this process? Unfortunately, it was one that COVID answered for us. That when we started the scoping study was right at the start of the pandemic, and really understandably, schools closed to research and we weren't able to involve students in this. But I think it's a really important point to highlight because it is something that we've not lost focus of, and it's something that Wes will talk more about how we actually incorporate student voice as part of this research. So to give you an idea of just the scope of the different countries involved, here is a map of just our regional workshop teams. They came from a really wide range of countries, and this makes the scoping study for ILESE the biggest cross-sector voice on what research needs to come next within innovative learning environments. We also had quite a good balance. We felt like we got good representation from those 3 areas that we were looking at, acknowledging that we had slightly higher participation from education, so different policymakers and practitioners across the world. And we were looking at 3 different areas. We had 3 questions that we wanted to answer during the scoping study. The first was what research exists. What do people know and use already so that we're not replicating, so that we actually have a bank of understanding of where we're at in research at the moment? Our second question was, what are the gaps? What do people actually want to know more about? It might not be that there's nothing done on that topic, but certainly something that we need to have much more information on. And then the next one was, what are the priorities? Based on what we found out, what actually needs to come next? What's most timely in terms of research? So what did we find from all of this? I'm going to start with the regional workshop teams. They first started, and some of you have actually been part of this, this will be a bit of a trip down memory lane. They answered two questions in the first workshop, which was, what research exists and what are the gaps? We did this through structured workshops, and again, depending on where we were in the world, these were in person or hybrid or sometimes completely online. But we used Miro boards to actually capture the information from all of our regional teams as they work together. We then went through a really inductive process of analysing this because this was really exploratory. We didn't know what people were going to say around the world. And we published the results of it in the first workshop report, which is available online. In the analysis that we did from what research exists, we found that there were three broad categories that we could group our research findings into. The first was that people named individuals or organisations. So, for example, John Hattie's work, really well-known work around the world, without saying that there was a specific paper, but just that work is influential. The second category were named projects or papers. So people would actually give us a reference to look up and say, this paper has been really good, as well as big projects. So an example would be Peter Barrett's work in Clever Classrooms, Wes and his team's work in ILETC, which has been mentioned today as well. And then the third category was just a topic. So for example, there's been lots of work done on design without sort of naming a really specific project or a paper or a person. When we looked at all the categories that we got, we thought about a few things. We noticed that there was actually no dominant author or topic. Across all of our 21 teams, we had hundreds of different listings of topics, people, papers, but every topic or person or paper had only been cited a handful of times. We also had lots of single-sided papers where only one person across the world said they use a particular piece of work. And so this suggested that actually we've got really good widespread dissemination, but there was nothing that was having significant impact that was driving our work across particular countries or across a particular field, because we didn't cite it, similar things. There was really good information to educators. They actually named topics 1 to 2 more times more frequently than our other participant groups. So we felt like there'd been some good dissemination to education practitioners. And we also noticed that really large projects or organisations, so like the OECD, like Learn, they got cited a lot, possibly because we think that there's been funding and a mandate there for these places and organisations and projects to actually push research findings out. The next question that we addressed was, what are the gaps? So again, backing into the Miro boards, we identified 20 different gaps across all of our regional workshops. And these 20 gaps that we collated, we found clustered into 4 key areas. The first was design issues. So what is the efficacy of these designs? How do we know that one design's better than another? And in what, under what circumstances? The next was teaching and learning issues. So how do things relate to, which I've heard come up today, how does it relate to learning outcomes? What does it mean? Another was health and well-being, both in terms of our physical well-being, in terms of mental health, in terms of our engagement and agency in school. And the last key cluster that we had was around education and system issues. How do we change things at a policy level or a system level to make sure that actually what students are getting is equitable across the board? And through this analysis, we also noted that actually the multidisciplinary nature of our project was really, really important. Just in this full document of our 20 gaps, there are some highlights. Those highlights, we think, are the gaps that wouldn't have been addressed if we'd just spoken to academics alone. And I've pulled one example out, which is the design of ILEs. We think that this probably, as an overall gap, would have come up with academics. But things like aesthetics and ambience, things like affordances, they're not terms that have come out of academia. They're terms that are really well used within industry. And we think that these specific gaps have come up because of the industry and the education participation in the research. So we had a sense of what the gaps were, where people wanted some more research. But then we needed to know, how do we prioritise these gaps? What do we actually do next in research? And so this became the subject of our second report for the scoping study. When we looked at our data overall, and we got first our regional teams to say that these 20 gaps actually were representative of the gaps, and then next rank them individually, we found the following. We found that people wanted more research around the evaluation of learning environments, that they needed more around affective learning outcomes or 21st century skills, that they still, despite saying that there was a lot of research on design, felt like we needed more research on design, more nuanced research on design. They wanted to know about the impact of different designs on student engagement, and they felt like we needed more research on health and wellbeing. And if you look at each one of those sectors that we've now separated out, you could see that 2 of those 3 sectors had every one of these top 5 within their own sector top 5. So we realised that there was really good consistency across different perspectives in terms of what needs to come next. We also looked at, were there regional differences based on people being located across 19 different countries? We grouped those 19 countries into 10 regions, and we found that actually 4 of our top 5 overall were shared by 80% of regions. Academic learning outcomes and health and wellbeing, so health and wellbeing, which snuck into our overall top 5, was shared in 6 out of the 10 regions that we identified. And from this analysis overall, we realised actually it's not just different sectors that have the same thoughts around what needs to come next, but globally there was starting to be an emerging agenda for what needs to happen in terms of learning environments research. But we haven't spoken about the Delphi study yet, which is the other approach that we used during the scoping study. So the Delphi study ran in parallel. They had no contact with our regional workshop teams. On this slide, you can see that the regional workshop teams are in orange, the Delphi experts are in blue, we as a management team are in green. Typically what would happen is we'd run a workshop and then we would have a discussion about the workshop, we'd formulate a survey and we would send it out to our Delphi experts, and they then operated that survey completely independently. The Delphi experts were 27 experts that were identified by the people in our regional workshop teams as being world leaders, either in academia, in education, or across industry. We had a subcommittee that then decided, out of all of the nominations that we received, who would approach for the Delphi study. And of course, one of the things about a Delphi study is that you have to have consensus at the end of it. The aim is that we achieve a really common idea and hopefully the panel will agree. So they had to keep going with their surveys until we achieved that consensus. And again, we published another report specifically on what the Delphis found around the gaps and priorities. And I'll share just a little bit of that now. What was known was actually quite similar between our research workshops and the Delphi experts. There were more cited papers when we did these surveys, but I would argue that that's probably the fact that this was an individual survey that people were sitting down to do. They had references at their fingertips on their computer as they were doing it, so it was a bit easier probably to recall what actually they wanted to put into our survey. We also noticed that when the Delphis were reflecting on the research that had come, they often grouped individuals or organisations with a particular research topic. And this was often a body of work. So OECD on ILEs generally, Terry Byers' work around measurement, Peter Barrett's work around classroom environment features. Our next job was that we realised that there were similar gaps, and we wanted to see whether the priorities differed between the Delphi experts and what we were finding in the workshops. We did this independently, again thinking, is there a change in the sectors? We need to make sure that we analyse this when it comes to the Delphi approach as well. But the pink highlighted boxes on each of the next 3 slides show you the overlaps between the workshop approach and the Delphi approach. So starting with our education panel, both really interested in learning outcomes and assessment, student engagement, and inclusiveness. In the allied industries, it was still evaluation of learning environments and the design of spaces, which is probably not unexpected given that that was everyone's profession in terms of the industries. They were also really interested in hybrid learning spaces. So that included both how technology was integrated in the classroom, but it also included what happens when you step off school site, what learning happens at home and in other places through technology. In terms of the academic panel, also evaluation of learning environments and design of spaces, which was actually the equal first for both groups in terms of this sector, as well as inclusion. So when we looked at those sectors, again, we realised in those different approaches that there was an emerging agenda. The evaluation of learning environments is really critical to everyone, which is the question that Wes is going to answer next. Learning outcomes, we acknowledge that there are some differences. Learning outcomes are really important, but those two different approaches said different things were important. So the workshop team said the 21st century learning skills is something that we have to get evidence on. Whereas the Delphi panels showed more actually those traditional academic measures, do scores increase, was important. And as a research team, we then said, actually, this means learning outcomes generally and how we think about them is important to this study. So I'll leave you with this, that we did find, I think we've got some good evidence to suggest that there is an international mandate around what research needs to come next within ILEs. And it goes into sort of three broad categories. The first is evaluation. We need data that can actually continue to drive us forward and give us the evidence when people question us about why things are done a certain way, both in terms of design and practice. We need evidence around learning outcomes. As I said, that really broad understanding of both how does academic outcome improve? How does our 21st century learning skills improve in these spaces? And we need information around health, wellbeing and inclusion, because that also has an impact on engagement. Running through all of these areas is design. What does it look like from the original design the whole way through to inhabitation for students? And that's the evidence that we're starting to collect now through the next phase of the study, the development phase that Wes will talk about. Thank you.